Welcome to our Zoom lessons on the writings of the Apostle Paul. My name is Jamie Knapp, and in this lesson, we will focus on Titus. Let's begin by sharing the screen and going to the PowerPoint slides and reminding ourselves that we're looking at three letters that collectively are known as the pastoral epistles. Paul is an older man now, and he is providing some shepherding guidance to not only to individuals, but also to the churches with whom they're working. In our previous lesson, we looked at 1 Timothy, written in 65 AD. In this lesson, we want to look at Titus, written about a year later, 66 AD, and then there will be one more letter to Timothy. We'll look at that in our next lesson. At the conclusion of the book of Acts, Paul is still in prison. We're told that he was in prison for 2 years, but the Bible doesn't really give us any details of what happens after that. Though if you read very closely in 2 Timothy, there are some hints that you can begin to put together that Paul ended up being in prison again. Now, from the work of Bible scholars, we can add to that, and we do know that Paul was released from Roman imprisonment after 2 years, his house arrest in Rome. And once he was freed from his imprisonment in Rome, then there's a possibility that Paul did travel to Spain and preach in Spain and plant churches there. And there is a sizable number of people who believe that Paul, in fact, did preach in Spain. And if he did, then this would have been an ideal time for that to happen. But the more likely scenario is that Paul returned to areas where he had been before, principally in Ephesus, as well as Macedonia. And along the way, he also traveled to an island in the Mediterranean Sea known as Crete. So let's pause for just a second and let's share a different screen so we can get our bearings on where we are geographically. Again, if you can see the cursor moving in the upper left corner, here's Rome. If Paul went to Spain to preach, it would have been to the left of Rome, west of Rome, off of the map that we can see. A more likely scenario is that Paul came to Ephesus. He had Timothy with him. They worked with the church in Ephesus, and then Timothy remained there while Paul moved on. Here's Crete. Crete is a fairly sizable island in the middle of the Mediterranean Sea. Titus and Paul came to Crete, worked with the church there. Many historians tell us that Crete consisted of just some fishing villages. There was not a major city there. Most say 6 small fishing villages. Titus would remain in Crete while Paul returned to Macedonia. And it was in this area that Paul was arrested for a second time. So this letter that we're focusing on in this lesson, Titus, would be sent or would have been written to an individual by the name of Titus, who was working with the very, very young developing church on the island of Crete. All right, let's get back to sharing the PowerPoint slides. As we just saw, Crete is an island in the Mediterranean Sea. What's interesting is that Paul actually had a very, very brief visit or stop on Crete, or very, very near Crete, while he was a prisoner being transported from Jerusalem to Rome. You can read about this in Acts chapter 27, specifically verses 7 through 13. What should have been, in good weather, a fairly easy trip from Jerusalem to Rome was fraught with all kinds of difficulties, somewhat because of the time of the year and just some other types of circumstances, shipwrecks and things of that nature. But Crete is mentioned during this time, and so it's possible, perhaps likely, that Paul actually had been on the island of Crete very briefly, and during his time there, he would have shared the gospel with whomever was willing to listen to him. Now, during the time after his release from prison, as I mentioned, Paul went to Ephesus with Timothy, and then Paul returned to Crete, and he brought along with him Titus. After being there for a period of time, Titus was left on Crete to continue working with the church. Paul returned to the mainland, principally to the area of Macedonia. And then it was from Macedonia, in all likelihood, that Paul wrote a letter back to Titus, who was still on the island of Crete. Titus was given a very, very hard job. He was asked to work with and establish and grow a church in a place where the folks were very, very, very rough. Crete was not a very developed area. As I said just a moment ago, small fishing villages. People who made their living either directly from the sea or as a result of people who made their living on the sea. It was a rough crowd. There was a man who was a Cretan. That's what individuals who lived on Crete were known as, Cretans. A man by the name of Epimenides, who wrote a description of his own people. And Paul included this in the letter to Titus. He said, Cretans have been described as liars, evil beasts, and lazy gluttons. And Titus is supposed to help grow a church in that environment. And so it was a difficult job. In chapter 3, in verse 12 of Titus, Paul lets Titus know that he does plan to send some help. He's going to send some co-workers to help Titus in this difficult job. But until that time, Paul outlined three main things that he wanted Titus to do with the church in Crete. Number one, appoint elders. Chapter 1, verses 5 through 9. This, by the way, is very similar to what we read in 1 Timothy chapter 3, verses 2 through 4. And it's not a coincidence, because Paul had just been in Ephesus with Timothy and had left Timothy there to work with that church, and he gave him instructions of appointing elders. He then moved to Crete with Titus, and he gave the same instruction. The church there needs leadership, not just you, Titus. It needs leaders from within. He instructs Titus to focus on sound doctrine, chapter 2, verses 1 through 10. Now, another way of saying sound doctrine is healthy teaching. Titus, you need to teach this church, this young and growing church, what they need to be a healthy, growing church that is grounded in sound doctrine. And part of sound doctrine had to do with the way the members were going to interact with one another and how they were going to behave. So he gave instructions for how older men were to act, and how older women were to act, and how younger women were to act, and how younger men were to act. And finally, Paul reminds Titus of the importance of grace, chapter 2, verses 11 through 15, as well as chapter 3, verses 5 through 7, reminding Titus, and of course, then reminding the church in Crete, that we are justified by the grace that comes to us from Jesus Christ as a gift. This is very similar to what we read in Ephesians chapter 2. Verses 8 through 9. And it's very consistent with Paul's message of grace that we've seen in Galatians, that we've seen in Romans, that we have seen in Ephesians. This is a central theme of the Christian faith, and Paul is reminding Titus of its importance and the need to share that with the believers in Crete. Well, that's our introduction to the letter of Titus. It's a short letter. It's only 3 chapters. Philemon only has 1 chapter, so it's the shortest of Paul's letters. 2 Thessalonians has 3 chapters. Titus has 3 chapters. So it's a short letter. It's a letter that can be written, or it can be read, rather, in one sitting. And it has some very, very good information about church leadership and about behavior that should occur within the church. In our next lesson, which will be the final in our class, we'll focus on 2 Timothy. I hope you can join us.